Welcome to Have a Bible Question Live, where you'll receive a Bible answer to your Bible question. And now, let's study the Bible.
Do you have a question? I saw a question just popped up on there.
Did we?
So,
All right. Well, let's start with that one. Why not?
Okay.
I've got some from that's been submitted, but
Okay.
we'll start with that one. Where did the practice of mechanical instruments come from or begin? All right. That is difficult because it depends on the perspective of how you're asking, is what I would start with, Troy, because if you're saying when in worship to God in general, we would say the Old Testament. My mind instantly would think New Testament in the New Testament church. But if you're saying when did it start with worship to God, I will readily admit to people that, yes, there were times in the Old Testament that the mechanical instruments of music, Rick, Becky Jones, good to see y'all. They're down in Orlando, by the way.
Oh, okay.
And they're still tuning in tonight. But there are examples, maybe y'all can give me one or two, where they were brought into the Old Testament worship. Not necessarily because God instructed it, but a man introduced it. You got something?
Yeah.
There?
For example, if you go to Amos chapter 5, verse 23 is one of the verses. A lot of times, whenever we're studying and talking about mechanical instruments of music in worship, in Amos chapter 5, verse 23, it says, "Take away from me the noise of your songs, for I will not hear the melody of your stringed instruments." And then you jump over to chapter 6, verse 5, and it says, "Who chant the sound of stringed instruments and invent for yourselves musical instruments like David." And that's typically where you see musical instruments come into the worship of God, come into the worship of the temple, was David introduced them, and that came about whenever he was bringing the ark up to Jerusalem so that it could be housed in the temple that he wanted to build. And you see him playing those instruments, and those were then introduced. And here Amos is, as a prophet, is calling those out as that's not what God intended. Another verse that comes to mind is Matthew chapter 9, verse 23. When Jesus came into the ruler's house, this is the ruler, the synagogue ruler that wanted Jesus to come and heal his child, this little girl. It says that when Jesus came into the ruler's house, verse 23, and saw the flute players and the noisy crowd wailing, this is part of their culture, and he went in and said, "Make room, the little girl's not dead." Now, the reason I bring that verse up is because there's another verse in the New Testament that shows that mechanical instruments of music existed even in the time of Jesus. Now, all that being said, let's go back to the question of
When did they first begin? We talked about in general worship to God, but what about New Testament church?
Yeah.
And one of the things that is so just very blatantly absent, is very a stark contrast, is that we don't have any example of them in the New Testament.
Yeah, simply just ask somebody, show me the book, chapter, and verse in the New Testament where you see the church in worship using musical instruments.
And I'm glad you qualified that, because I said in the New Testament, some people will take you to the book of Revelation, and there's always "as the harpers harping" phrase, and they're saying, "Well, see you in heaven." And
We can deal with that as well. I mean, that you just did in heaven.
yeah,
And also don't forget, Revelation's full of figurative language.
exactly.
And, God doesn't need an instrument of music.
So what we're really saying is that the in that particular book, that doesn't justify anything as far as what the New Testament church is doing here.
Now,
That doesn't even mean it's going to be harps there. Remember,
That's right.
There's a lot of figurative, like you said. Now, so if there's nothing in New Testament, I would really encourage you. I'm going to try and share this link to you. Christian Courier is a great resource for a lot of material. I don't necessarily endorse everything. Like I wouldn't endorse everything of every man. But great article that is on their website, and I knew I could find it here. William Woodson actually goes back to M.C. Curfee's M.C. Curfeys, who cites older historians and encyclopedias who will actually date the introduction of the instrumental music in church worship from the early 600s.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some people will actually say it was under a pope within the 7th century, and in the 6th, which would be the 600s,
yeah.
which
Mhm.
would be Pope.
Boniface, I believe.
Is it Boniface?
Could be wrong.
I can't remember. Let's call you right for now.
I want to say it's Boniface III, somewhere right around there, something like that, that introduced it into I think what it was an organ. Was it an organ or a piano or something along those lines, if I'm not mistaken? But
It was an organ at that time
All right,
that
so-
the Pope introduced.
point being 600.
600 years after.
Yeah. So for all the New Testament period, the first century church, which is what we're trying to replicate, the first century church, there's no book, chapter, and verse that you can find. If you go to the early church, what's called the early church fathers, they're basically historians. There are no references in there of instrumental music being used. In fact, what's interesting is if you really look at it, a lot of even the denominational leaders would say things like, I have no problem with instrumental music as long as it's not seen or heard in the church.
Luther in his Reformation movement that he sparked, I hate to call it his movement, but he
Right.
sparked that Reformation movement. That was one of the things he was trying to rid of. He recognized it was not there. You can go through several of these reformists, and they realized that was something that was added. In fact, if you look at Greek Orthodox, remember the Great Schism takes place before the 600s. What year?
No, it was 1054, I believe, right? The split between the Greek Orthodox, the Patriarch, and the Pope, and the Roman Catholic Church, it was 1054, I believe. But
Is that right?
Yeah.
I believe that's correct.
Yeah. But the Greek Orthodox chose to not implement in as far as in their worship to make
Right.
sure. I'm trying to remember. My brain went like 20 places. I was trying to remember in 300. There was a split that took place then as well. I want to say 354, but I'm wrong. But anyway, there was a split that wouldn't be the Great Schism, but another.
No, the Great Schism
Okay.
was many years later.
1054.
yeah.
The 300s
That's what I
would be
was thinking
around the
of.
time of the Nicene Council, and there was
That's
probably
what I'm
a
thinking.
split in regards to Easter, in regards to Christ and his nature, and things like that. That's where when we say split, we're talking about people who were using the name Christian, not necessarily the New Testament
I believe
church.
that was 325, wasn't it?
Right, but he was saying around
Yeah.
300.
Yeah.
That was still
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd
in
be.
effect.
Okay.
I do want to add on here, I appreciate Alan Drury putting 2 Chronicles 29 in the Old Testament. The only certain instruments and only certain people were authorized. Now, I wouldn't say by God to use, because even this is after David, and this is in the time of King Hezekiah. And I want to read that real quick. And he stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals and stringed instruments and with harps according to the commandment of David. Yeah, I think that's important to read there. Of Gad, the king's seer, and of Nathan the prophet, and thus was the commandment of the Lord by his prophets. And you go down through there, the Levites stood with the instruments of David. See, I love how the Bible's so clear, and the priest with the trumpet. So maybe, God tolerated it.
One of the
but
times
notice
of this ignorance God winked at, but now can't.
Exactly.
All men everywhere to repent.
Exactly. But each time I notice it's qualified with instruments of David. And so I find that, and the king Hezekiah commanded them to offer burnt offerings.
Well,
and stuff
think
like
about even pause for a moment. Which is weird that he tolerated, because he didn't with Nadab and Abihu. I mean, we draw that distinction of strange fire, but there wasn't. I don't think he had the specifics things that he authorized regarding that, and that's why he tolerated parts of this. And what I mean by that is, look to the worship that he instituted. Go read the book of Leviticus.
that. Mhm.
Read Deuteronomy and start reading the things that he instituted. He was very clear. He was very spoken on certain things, and he did not allow them to deviate at all from that. But you actually don't see the singing being addressed within there.
No, and then when you think about God tolerating things, it doesn't mean he approves of them.
Exactly.
He tolerates things, and you can add other things in there. For example, you have the patriarchs with polygamy. That's not the design that God made for the church, or it's made for marriage, but he tolerated it because of man's. I think that was a great verse. In these times of ignorance, he winked at,
which is found
in
Acts
17:30.
Mm-hmm.
And now I don't want to make it sound like I was misrepresenting Alan there. He does go on to say that under the law of Christ we have authority to sing, and then he mentions several wonderful verses: Colossians 3:16 and 17, Ephesians 5:19, Hebrews 13:15. You can go to 1 Corinthians 14, and so all of those are sing, 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 sing.
So when do we see it begin? If we go to the Old Testament, we see the idea of the introduction, most likely during the period of David, which I wouldn't be surprised of, or prior, according to some. But it was introduced by man, not by God, in Old Testament worship.
Right.
When we go to when was it introduced, as far as when did it begin in Christianity, I guess we could say.
Mm-hmm.
I say that loosely there. It wasn't until the 600s, and it was introduced by man, not by God. But we can say that as far as music in the church, we have an approved, authorized music, and that is to sing with our hearts psalms, hymns, spiritual songs, Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3 and verse 16, and we can do that with the authority of God and know that we're pleasing to him.
Exactly. And let me clarify just one other point so that if somebody's listening and they get confused, notice we keep saying New Testament, because what often happens is when somebody wants to talk about instrumental music, the first thing they'll do is say, well, in the book of Psalms, or in this chapter, or in this verse, and it's always in the Old Testament. And Colossians 2, verse 14, along with Hebrews 9 and many other verses, Jesus nailed the old law to the cross. We are no longer under that old law. It was a tutor to lead us to Christ.
Galatians 6.
Mm-hmm. And we are no longer under that old law, so we are under the law of Christ, once again, Galatians 6. And so therefore, that's why we keep saying that. And so, according to what we read, it is not authorized. You can't say, as a member of the Lord's body, you cannot say, we are authorized to use mechanical instruments in our worship service. And that's where we get ourselves in trouble. You know, Matthew 7:21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter in, except he who does the will of my Father in heaven. You do his will, or you don't get into heaven.
Exactly. You know, Becky Jones added on here when you were talking about times of this ignorance. Another example was where God tolerated divorce in Matthew chapter 19.
That's right.
Jesus is very clear. It's because of the hardness of your hearts. Mm-hmm. Moses, isn't it interesting there? Moses suffered you to put away your wives. And so
don't put that on me.
It kind of implies it was a man's invention, you know.
That's kind of like guys saying, don't you put that on me. That's not me. I was very specific about what I want in my creation. Right. If, to put it that way, for not trying to speak for God, but